Hello. This video is going to be about Saudi women being allowed to drive. But it's also about how this social change, which we in the West think so amusing, might indicate something far more serious than we realise. First of all, the news. Saudi women are now legally permitted to drive cars. Some Saudi men appear to think that this means the end of the world, and it may be. I'll get to that in a couple of moments. Meanwhile, I have to point out that although the law has changed, it isn't quite what it seems, because although a woman can get a driving licence, she has to be given permission to do so by a government department. And even in the best run countries, government departments tend to be a bit of a bottleneck. And in Saudi, well, it is the Middle East. It looks as if, since they're unable to fill their bottles with red wine, they've gone instead for filling them with red tape. Anyway, despite the fact that there are celebratory social media pictures of women holding their brand new driving licences up to the camera, only 30 women in Jeddah have actually been given the crucial permission, while thousands who've applied for that permission are still waiting. Which leads me to my first question: can this simply be a PR exercise? Oh yeah, the odd princess might get to drive, but apart from that, the rest of Saudi womanhood is stuck at home as before. Well, it could be. Certainly women were never actually forbidden to drive. On the other hand, there were barriers, mostly social and unacknowledged, but quite real for all that. I want to stress, I'm not having a go at men over this. Part of the resistance came from the women themselves. It was during the First World War that large groups of women learnt to operate motor vehicles in any great numbers. They drove motorbikes as messengers, and they drove ambulances, even in combat zones, and they drove trucks to deliver things. The numbers of women drivers further increased during the Second World War, with many women encouraged one way or the other to learn to drive, as it was considered a useful skill for the war effort. But after the war ended, driving for women was again one of those unnecessary things which, like jobs for married women, it was only right and proper to jettison when the men came back from the front. The few women who did drive were doing so because they had to, for work. And remember, most women were expected to stay home after marriage. Or if they did drive around, they were either A, rich, or B, a bit morally ambiguous, or both. You will see that in all sorts of Agatha Christie novels. You can be sure that if a woman turns up at the country house driving her own car, and it was usually a sports car, wasn't it? You just know that the woman is probably a bit wild and almost certainly up to no good. When by the late 50s the family car was becoming a thing, it was always a saloon which was driven by the head of the household. And as we know, the head of the household is always the man. The women who'd driven unwieldy ambulances, staff cars and delivery vehicles during the war were deemed by one and all not to be either skilled enough or responsible enough to handle a large car, especially with the entire family in it. Even when in the 1960s, with an increase in general prosperity, when families started to buy a second car for the little woman, it was always some sort of a Mini which these ladies used for short trips to the shops or taking the children to ballet lessons. But the family saloon was not for them. After all, the family saloon was too big and precious for a woman to drive. I'm just going through all of this to point out that picturesque attitudes to women drivers are not just the preserve of those gentlemen in the Middle East who wear scarves on their heads. It was also the preserve of British gentlemen who wore bowler hats. And this attitude was quite prevalent throughout the United Kingdom until the late 1960s, when a piece of legislation changed everything. Now, it will not have escaped your attention that women were considered not fit to drive right up to the moment where it was necessary to have drivers, at which point it suddenly became all right. And the same thing happened in 1967. What eventually got women behind the steering wheel of the family saloon in Britain were the drink driving laws. In 1967, there were two sets of legislation specifying the legal limit of alcohol in a car driver's blood, while at the same time the police got the technology to determine those levels, and with that the status of women drivers changed completely, because men started to realise that if they wanted to go to the pub and have a beer, or several, either one of them would have to spend the evening drinking orange juice so he could ferry his mates back home at the end of the evening, or they could bring their wives and girlfriends along and let them drink the orange juice and then drive the return journey. Since the men preferred not to go out in their wives' cramped and unstable minicars, suddenly all the objections to women driving the bigger family saloons, oh, they're too big, you won't be able to handle the power, you'll have trouble parking it, stuff like that, and so on, all these objections disappeared almost overnight. I'm not having a go at men specifically, but I did want to point out that throughout history, whenever women have become emancipated, it has not been because of their protests or indeed any logical arguments. Oh yeah, women could kick and scream as much as they liked, and they could write books called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, but whatever they did, they got their rights only when it became either economically or socially necessary for that to happen. Either money or some sort of an earthquake forced it. Is that the women's fault or the men's fault? Well, I have heard it said by anthropologists that women get the sort of men they deserve, which always sounded to me a bit cruel and harsh. But there's no doubting that the women's driving issue tends to support that idea. As I said, it was as much pressure from other women as disagreement from men that restricted this aspect of female freedom. So, that being the case, we have to wonder what has impelled Saudi to allow its women to drive. Obviously, it's not drink driving laws, and even with the Saudi marriage customs, I doubt it has to do with the men wanting one of their wives to drive them around the desert while they indulge in some hanky-panky with one of the other wives in the back seat. No, there has to be some other reason. Maybe it's the sudden realisation that they're running out of oil and will have to rely on their entire population to generate income instead of just half of it. Perhaps it's because slave labour is getting more difficult to source. I'm not sure what it is. I don't think anyone is sure, but I do know there has to be a pressing reason which we in the West don't know about. It may be that the Saudis don't know about it either, by the way. Very often social change is generated by a completely unconscious imperative. But I do think that Saudi is possibly in more trouble than we know. Or maybe even more trouble than the Saudis know. When a society so obsessed with controlling its women just lets go in this way, it can't be simply a sudden desire to be modern, although that might be the ostensible reason. There's something up. I'd love to know what it is, but no doubt we'll all find out sooner or later, and my prediction is that it'll be sooner rather than later.